Welcome back, and we made it. It is part 7 of our exhaustive 7-part look at the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson's classic 1966 album Pet Sounds. And with this, we will have completed what I think is the most comprehensive and exhaustive, some might say overly detailed, examination of this great album, and I think we're all happy that we made it this far. Anyway, before we start in, I just want to make a quick little pitch. This channel does have a Patreon, and we do allow people to contribute one-time contributions to keep the channel going. I haven't really pushed this that much because I haven't been putting videos up as frequently, but I just thought I would mention it. It does help me put in the time to do this, but if that's beyond your ability at the moment, do not worry about it. I'm just happy that you're here. But you will find all the details for that in the first comment for this video below. So anyway, we are now going to delve into the final 3 songs on Pet Sounds. And the first of these is a monumental track in the Beach Boys' history, albeit one that is not as well known as, say, Help Me Rhonda. And the song is I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. Now let's first talk about the musicians that made this great track. Starting with, on harpsichord, Mike Melvoin, or Melvoin? Yeah, I should have figured out how to pronounce that. But anyway, he is a pretty legendary figure, and he is also the father to Wendy Melvoin of Prince's band and also of Wendy and Lisa. So he did good work in many ways. After that, we have on tack piano Don Randy, the great Glenn Campbell and Barney Kessel on 12-string guitars, Glenn on acoustic, Barney on electric, Ray Pullman on 6-string electric bass, Chuck Berghofer on upright bass, Hal Blaine doing double duty once again on drums and timpani, Frank Capp on percussion, Steve Douglas on sax, Plas Johnson and Bobby Klein on the Norma clarinets, Jay Migliori on the bass clarinet, Tommy Morgan on bass harmonica once again, and on the electro theremin, Mr. Paul Tanner, and we'll have more to say about that in just a moment. Vocally, we have all 6 Beach Boys singing, and this song's noteworthy because it originally was to be Dennis's sole lead vocal on Pet Sounds. Brian wound up replacing Dennis's vocal with his own, and there's a little bit of controversy on this because when the vocals-only mixes of this song were released, some sharp-eared listeners noticed that the ending of a couple of lines of the song sounded very Dennis-like, and they hypothesized that Brian, when he went over Dennis's vocal, left a couple of the ending words to some of the lines Dennis had originally sung alone to preserve Dennis's tonality there, but Brian doing a presumably superior technical take on the rest of the vocal. And there is, in fact, a pretty noticeable punch out just prior to one of these spots. And punching out in the 60s, sorry if I'm getting ahead of you on the studio nomenclature, but when you are going over a track for your vocal and let's say there's a part of it that you want to replace, the entry point of the recording is called a punch in and the exit point is called a punch out. And for many years, punching out was more technically difficult to do than punching in. It would tend to, because of the recording technology at the time, leave some kind of a sonic artifact, and we do indeed hear that at one of these places. So it was easier to punch in than to punch out, and generally in the old days when you were doing it, you would try to punch out at a place where there was a big gap in the vocal. So anyway, I want to, before I go any further on this topic, call out Craig Slowinski, who is the world's leading Beach Boys session expert, and his crew, who are always generously contributing their knowledge and their input to this show. And generally, I defer to them on who plays what and who sings what. Occasionally, I will weigh in with my own ears. This is one of those times because they've reached a consensus at this point that this is not Dennis. There isn't a little bit of Dennis on this vocal. This is all Brian on the vocal, and he just there's some places where he sounds like Dennis. And I do agree there are some places that are Dennis-like that do sound like it's Brian doing a Dennis imitation. However, this is one of these rare occasions when I'm going to disagree with the experts I consult with. I actually do believe pretty strongly that you do hear Dennis Wilson at a couple spots. 17 seconds in, it sounds like Dennis on both the tracks, and at 1 minute and 33 seconds, on at least one and possibly both. And the first one of those is preceded, as I said, by an audible punch out. It's not just because it sounds like Dennis, although it sounds exactly like Dennis. It's also the vocal technique I can hear he's using to get the notes. It's very key to how Dennis used to sing, but it's not something that's really in Brian's wheelhouse. I've never heard him do it. But you know, be that as it may, I think it's Dennis, and also it's just not so likely, for the reasons I just said, that Brian would have done a punch out on his own vocal, since he'd be technically capable of doing the whole line himself. I mean, it's not impossible, but it would be strange for him to punch out on his own vocal rather than just do the whole line and then punch out in a less obvious place. So my personal opinion is that there is a sliver of Dennis Wilson lead vocal on this along with Brian. And if so, and again, as I always like to say, I wasn't there, so I don't know for sure, but that's my opinion. If so, that gives Dennis a slight lead vocal representation of the album, even slighter than Al's 3 lines or whatever it was on I Know There's an Answer. But still cool that Dennis, you get a little bit of Dennis, and the parts that sound like Dennis sound noticeably like Dennis, so it does kind of stick out, you know, those spots. So anyway, Brian Wilson on lead vocal for 99%, possibly Dennis on lead vocal for 1%. One thing also about Dennis's influence on this track, you know, when Brian goes, when they say, I got brains, but they ain't doing me no good, there is a noticeable strain in his voice, and it's the kind of good strain you get with rock singing where you're really expressing an emotion. This is not something Brian did a lot. It's particularly in his regular range. He tended to sing pretty clean, and it really gives emotional effect to this track. And I think, once again, this is Brian, you know, and also to sort of give due credit to the experts of their take on this, I think that is indeed Brian doing a sort of imitation of Dennis's impassioned kind of vocal delivery. So there's a lot of Dennis's vocal influence on this track, even if there is little, or some would say no, Dennis' presence on the lead vocal. But he certainly sings on it anyway in the backup, if nowhere else. Speaking of other notable band contributions to this track, if you want an example of Bruce Johnston's falsetto supremacy, just look no further than the F5 that Bruce hits at the very end. It's peak Bruce, and he was actually asked to do it on the 2012 reunion tour, and I've been told that he just kind of went, okay, and then he did it, and he kills it there too. Still could do it. Some good Bruce action on the falsetto at the end. We'll talk a little bit more about the vocals at the end in a moment. Instrumentally, lots to talk about here, but of course the main event here is the use of what is officially called the Tannerin, or the electrotheremin. This is an electronic instrument similar to a ribbon strip on a Moog synthesizer that was used to emulate the sonic effect created by another instrument called a theremin. Theremin, it's an instrument that goes woo woo, if I recall correctly, I'll post a picture of it here. But it's something like an antenna, and I've never played one, so I'm sort of not an expert on this. But what I do know is you would get your pitch from this instrument from the movement of your hand closer and further to this object that I've just called an antenna, and obviously that's pretty imprecise for the purposes of recording, and so Tanner, who is a session guy, had invented this sort of ribbon. It's basically, I have actually seen one of these. Probin Gregory came over to my house, Probin from Brian's band, to do a session once, and he brought over this thing, and you've probably seen it in videos, but it's like a little. There's like a graphic of a keyboard on it, and there's a little wand you play over with it. So it's very similar, as I said, to running your finger across the pitch ribbon on a Moog synthesizer. So you'll have an approximation of where the key and the note are, but because of the free-flowing nature of the tones, in other words, it's not stepped up, you know, there are microtones involved, you would put the wand up and back, and that's how you could control this sort of wild woo-woo sonic effect. I don't know if I explained that very well, but anyway, so among music geeks, like there's this big controversy that people call this a theremin when it's not really a theremin, it's a tannerin or an electrotheremin, and that's the difference. The theremin is something you use your hands, the distance of your hands and the movement of your hands to get your pitch, and this is more like a keyboard that you run your finger over, basically. But the effect is the same. It goes woo, like that, right? So this was a sound that primarily had been heard on horror movies. And not for the first time, probably for about the 10th time in reviewing this album. This again implies to me that Brian was getting a lot of his sonic ideas from his TV watching and his movie watching. And this is a pretty direct evidence of this. And somebody on Wikipedia or somewhere made the point that there was a TV show at the time called My Favorite Martian that Brian was apparently fond of watching, and this instrument was used extensively in that show. Brian himself has talked about hearing it in movies as a kid. I can't help but think both exposures are in play in terms of why Brian had the idea to use this instrument. But obviously this is, I believe, the very first time it was ever used in a rock and roll context, and it's used very effectively. In fact, what's kind of cool about this is, and I'm going to delve into this in a minute, the whole song is about social alienation, and the way this sort of sound from outer space that is very much associated with horror movies and science fiction, which is basically stories of outsiders, right? Horror movies are about scary and freaky monsters and people that are outside the norm, and outer space and science fiction is kind of the same thing. So you have the sound that's associated with things that are weird, and it kind of comes in at the very end of the song in a way that it's almost hard to discern whether it's an actual human voice or not, and one could be forgiven for thinking that it might have been, as some reviewers said at the time, just a different way Brian had thought of to process one of the band members' voices. But it very closely approximates the sound of a voice. But the way this instrument just appears towards the end of the song really, in one of the most straightforward ways, illustrates the way Brian uses sound to get, on a subliminal level, the message through that he's trying to also put through lyrically. Because what can underscore the sense of a human being's social isolation than the warped sound of a human voice interpreted in such a way through this electrotheremin to conjure up ideas of horror movies and science fiction? How alien can you get as a sound to convey the alienness that is felt by the singer? So this is one of the most brilliant ways Brian uses unusual sound to get his emotional points across. And, to double back to the whole Dennis and Brian thing, regardless of who did it, it makes perfect sense to me that Brian would want to interpret this song with some of Dennis's vocal rawness, even if Dennis was incapable of putting across the vocal to his satisfaction. Makes perfect sense to me that Brian would incorporate Dennis's tonality into his vocals and or leave bits of Dennis's raw emotionalism from his prior take that he himself could not quite do. So whichever way it was, it's very interesting use of really subtle elements to underscore what he's trying to say. So there's also another odd sound in the that's kind of been the background in the first verse on the original mixes of it, where apparently there was a rewind of a tape during the mono mix down, and someone had failed to mute the channel, and so there's this weird little otherworldly whine that is interspersed during the first verse, and that's a very cool, if accidental, sort of underscoring of this whole alien, weird, disassociated and isolated feeling that the track is trying to convey. And Brian was not certainly above using happy accidents to further his artistic vision. This is one of those situations. Now, in introducing this song on his later solo tours, Brian said something akin to, well, actually he said exactly this: here's a social statement kind of lyric you might like. In typical Brian fashion, he's undercutting or underplaying the impact of this song. I Just Wasn't Made for These Times is not a Beach Boys classic in the way California Girls is. But for those in the know, this song is something of an anthem for neurodivergent people, people on the spectrum, people that are socially awkward, people that just have issues communicating or integrating with society, also people that have a little visionary in them and feel underappreciated by the world around them. This is not a sentiment that was expressed often, if at all, in music up to this time. It's a very unmainstream kind of thing to say. It is extremely on the nose for Brian for what he was going through at the time and where how he felt in his interior life in a way that he rarely was after, you know, in terms of at least the sophistication of how he talked about what he was going through. Brian's later work was certainly autobiographical, but a lot of what made it autobiographical was the childlike nature of his lyricism, which doesn't get at the depth of what he was feeling as much as a song like this does. So for people, including myself, I've talked a little bit about when I heard this album at age 14 or 15, it didn't hit that hard. This song certainly did, and it did for a lot of people. Music like this is one of the reasons that the Beach Boys have found a whole new audience among Gen Z and young musicians coming up today that are very tapped into the idea of being neurodivergent, see it as a virtue, see it as something that is an individual quality to be celebrated, but one that deals significant challenges in terms of dealing with everyday life. This is the first song, perhaps, that really speaks to that experience, and there's a whole lot of people in the world that have had that experience. And it's really interesting because, of course, although these are Brian's ideas, it fell to Tony Asher to interpret them. And Tony Asher was very much not, well, I can't speak for him diagnostically, but he does not seem to be a neurodivergent individual. And it was a difficult song for him to write to because he just didn't relate to the topic. And it's all the more extraordinary and all the more impressive how well he captures this idea, interprets the thoughts of not just Brian, but many of us who have experienced these same kind of senses of social isolation or being ahead of the crowd or seeing things other people didn't see. And even if we were right or we were right to our own vision, it wasn't something that other people appreciated or understood and probably wouldn't for 20 or 25 years, which is exactly the case with this song and with Pet Sounds. I mean, at the time, what Brian was trying to say went over many people's heads, right? But as generations went by and sensitivities and understandings of human nature evolved, songs like this became very meaningful. And so it was way out of its time and a brave thing to write about to a teenager audience. And there's a lot of these lines, and it's significant again that a lot of these, there's all these interlocking vocal lines. And Brian could have easily had the whole band, who are vocally on this track, sing the counterpoint lines. Like Brian could have sung one, and Al could have sung one, and Dennis could have sung one, but no, it's all Brian. Brian's singing this, Brian's singing that, and they all have these different lyrical messages, underpinned by what's the most prevalent one? Sometimes I feel very sad. That hits pretty hard. Sometimes I feel very sad. And the way the melody falls off at the end and the sense of resignation that conveys. And then you've got another line, ain't found the right thing I could put my heart and soul into. The inability to sort of commit to the things other people find interesting or that capture your interest because you just, everything else seems too mundane. A lot of artists have felt this. And then you get the third statement, people I know don't want to be where I'm at. Same deal. And those are the lyrics that Brian is repeating. And then you have the whole band singing lyrics in Spanish. Like, not only people are not going to understand it because it's in Spanish, but people aren't even going to pick out what's being said in the mix. And in fact, people didn't know exactly what was being said until the vocal-only mixes appeared in the 90s. O cuando será una dia será, which all gets us to this sense of yearning and of displacement and of dissatisfaction and a need to find new vistas, new boundaries, new things to explore that other people don't relate to. And how does it make you feel? It makes you feel very sad. Now, you know, I'm just going to talk about how this song hits me a little bit, only to represent those of you who don't have a show, who have similar feelings, and not to make it about myself. But, you know, I'm a guy that left his whole life in music to go live overseas. There were a lot of reasons for that. But one of the big ones was, even though I was getting older, I still had a lot of things I wanted to do. I had a lot of things I wanted to explore. As much as I love talking about the Beach Boys and I love music history and things like that, I don't want to live my life there. Even though that's what I'm talking about right now. You know, when I go out the door, I'm in Cambodia and I'm going to be doing things that have nothing to do with that. I'm going to be living a 2025 life, exploring and doing things that interest me that have nothing to do with these things. I need that sense of exploration to be happy. And so to take that back to what Brian is saying here, this is a flashing red light, because what Brian is saying is he needs to explore, he needs to have new vistas. And if he doesn't have them, and if nobody else is around there to really explore with him, or gets what he's doing, he doesn't really have another place to go. And we're going to see this play out later in the year and into the following year, because we're going to see Brian get to a point where he can't move forward anymore. He no longer feels that he has the support system to keep moving forward. But he has no real alternate path, and we're going to see Brian, sadly, regress and stop developing in certain ways that he had been up till now. And you can see what he's saying right here, like, I need to grow. I need to move forward to continue nurturing myself, but nobody really gets what I'm doing, and I need the other personal appreciation to bounce this sense of exploration off of, or else I don't feel validated. Hey, you know, I get that. I know a lot of you get that too. And the struggle Brian's going through here is both a struggle in terms of his mental health and his artistic expression. And when he speaks for it so directly and so bluntly and so in such a heartfelt manner, and as I said, with a rawness that is very Dennis and very unlike Brian, he speaks for a lot of us in this song. The song's importance, it's one of the few Beach Boys songs, I think, that is almost more important for its lyric content than it is for the music. But of course, I mean, the music that Brian spun into it, as with everything on Pet Sounds, achieves its impact by how well the choices Brian makes in terms of the chords he uses, the melodies, and most of all, the production and instrumental choices he makes. How much that, as I've said before, on a subliminal level, amplifies the sense of alienation, loneliness, and social dissatisfaction. So, bravo. And this song's importance was realized in Brian's solo years. It was realized when it was included in the 2012 reunion tour. That was very much an acknowledgement of the place that this song has in the Beach Boys pantheon. It's as a hit sing-along number, it fails miserably. Except, maybe that's the wrong thing to say, because you're not going to be up there going, ba 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 barand at this song. But if you're in a certain place, and you don't have to be autistic or Asperger's or in other ways, as I use the common phrase, neurodivergent, to relate to the feeling late into the night, sometimes I feel very sad. We've all been there. And to the extent that you're ready to open yourself up to that feeling, what Brian has done here, there's almost no better way to salve that hurt. You know, Elton John, much later in much more simplistic terms, talked about sad songs saying so much. If someone else is suffering, I have to write it down, and every single word makes sense, and it's easier to have those songs around. Elton John and Berry Taupin certainly bet Sounds fans, and I would bet this is one of the songs they were thinking of. Some things to talk about musically. The sort of gauziness of the track, and you know, the interpolation of the drums and timpanis, the lead bass line centered on a major scale. These are all things we've seen in other songs on Pet Sounds. So the sort of ghostly pattern of the track is, I don't want to say it's sort of standard issue for Pet Sounds, because it's not, but it is of a piece of what we've already heard. And what makes this track special is the extremely personal lyrics, the counterpunctual words that Brian chooses to sing himself, the use of the theremin and the weird little tape machine sound to convey a sense of alienness. The very lush vocal harmonies, especially towards the end. But one of the most unique things about this track is the chord sequence, which is quite intricate, and we will delve into that right now. Hey there, so I just spent some time working up, I just wasn't made for these times, and there's so much wild stuff in there. I'm actually just gonna launch right into filming this before I forget it. This is all my own transcription. Prepper Gregory and I once talked about this, about like how to track down the exact voicings and the exact chords of everything on Pet Sounds, and he made a very valid point that there's so many overtones and so many close intervals and so many different instruments playing so many different things. It's really impossible to completely know what's going on. So that's one reason, besides the fact that there's so many inaccurate transcriptions on the net, that I wanted to dig in and delve in for myself. And so on this and a couple of other tunes, I just did my own transcription. And I'm glad I did for this, because whoa, crazy stuff. So anyway, starting right in on the verse, it's the same kind of thing that we've seen in other songs in this, where Brian is doing a descending thing in his left hand, whole steps. That's the bottom movement. And then in the top, he's doing four-fingered chords mostly, and he's shifting things up and down a half step. So the first chord is a B flat over a C, then shifting down to the B flat, it goes to a D minor 7 on the top, which I guess would be a B flat 9, I believe. Then going down to the A flat in the bass. The bottom three notes shift up a half step for this. What would that be? An E flat minor 6 over an A flat, I guess. And then then he shifts back down a half step to the D minor 7, which is over the G and the F. And then we transition back. And also, notice, again, I'm going to talk about how sort of unstable and uneasy these chords sound. So notice you're starting right out with a B flat over a C. So you've got a dissonant root that is a 2 in the root. So you're starting the song with a 2 in the root, and it's kind of like, whoa, what's going on here, right? Like, I'm already disoriented. I'm already lost. Okay, so anyway, so the second half of the verse. Then we do this cool little thing where we have the D minor over G again, but then we bring the top two notes of the right hand chord down a half step. So, and notice the dissonance here. You have a G in the bass, which if you put it in this, the top chord would be this. So you've got another very dissonant chord. And then we shift quite unusually to just a standard E flat major chord. Then to the D minor 7, which we've already had, but the straight D minor 7, which goes to the, I believe it's the relative minor 7, G minor 7. Then the G stays in the bass while the D minor, while the right hand shifts back to the D minor 7, which is kind of clever. And then we do that same move again. which we had at the end of the A section. So that part again is E flat. There's kind of a little movement in the bass. Dum, dum, bum, ba, da, 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 da. Okay, so now things get pretty wild. Up to this point, most of the instrumental backing has been the harpsichord mixing with the reverb. That's the primary backfill of the sound on this, and it's Brian singing solo. And at this point, the vocals come in and the backing shifts to, I mean, the chordal backing. You have the percussion dominating, the da-da-da-da-da-da-da, but the instrumental backing shifts from predominantly harpsichord to predominantly, I believe it's clarinets, bass clarinets. I don't have the instrumental credits in front of me, but that's what it sounds like, and that's what I'm assuming it is. And so right here, I want to call attention to the fact that the root goes to C, and the root will not move all the way through this and through nearly all of the chorus. It's just going to be chord notes on the root. And it's easy to miss that because there's so much else going on. But I think this is important because this is a very intense song for Brian, and what's interesting about this is I'm going to show you that on the top, on the right hand, there's so much dissonance and so much sort of shifting harmonic uncertainty. I mean, the impression it's going to create as you hear it is unease because stuff's all crushed together, it's milling around in weird ways, and it's all the time it's against this. That never stops. So that's right away. Remember when I was talking about how the music subliminally gets across what Brian's trying to say in some of these songs? You have this sort of intense, like pounding, like you're pounding your head against a wall, with this C just repeating in the bass, and it sounds like it changes, but actually it never does. But on the right, in the top half, there's just, it's like, it's as if part of you is pounding your head against the wall, and another part of you was just constantly confusing, shifting, moving your thoughts around. That's the instrumental impression these chords create. So let me show you what's going on to the best of my ability, because there's a lot going on. So the backing track, which is dominated by the horns, is mostly pedaling over that. There's a kind of a high F that's kind of going over that. There's a D that's persisting, and then there's movement from the B flat to the A. Da, 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 da. So you're pretty much going from I think there is a G in we'll see there's a G in the vocals. I'm not quite sure if there's a G in the backing track or not, but let's add it just to keep things straight. G minor 7 to D minor 7, G minor 7 to D minor 7. Again, it's actually that same progression we just saw, G minor 7 to D minor 7, but now we're over this insistent atonal C, which again, just like when the song starts, it's not a root to either chord. So we've got this, right? Something like that. But when we put the vocals on top, there's movement in the vocals. It's going like this. It sounds the same, right? But it's not, because the instrumental backing is doing a G minor 7 or a B flat, depending on whether the G's there or not. But a G minor 7 over C or a B flat over C. But the vocals are doing an E flat major 7. There's a movement from E flat to D. I think Al is singing it. And there's also movement in the bottom, which Mike is singing, which is an E flat to C. So the E flat is definitely there. And it's interesting listening, because I had to listen very carefully, because they sound kind of uncertain on the note. It's kind of waffling a little bit. And as well, they should, because there's no E flat on the track. It's a D. So they're singing this. They're singing E flat over a D. So what that winds up being, if you put all those notes together, is this. Okay? And you probably just recognize the record because you can hear all those sounds. But look at my hand. If I put the root up top, you've got this. It's basically every note in the B flat major scale except for an A. Okay, Okay, that is some dissonant crap. So then we've got this. That's the effect created by the vocals bumping up against the instrumental track. Okay, that's crazy. Think I got something good going for myself. So then we go to the next part. Sometimes I feel very sad. Sounds like it changes. It does. The chords change, but in a way they don't, because we're still got the C in the bottom. The instrumental track is very murky, and you really can't make out the chords, but it certainly sounds like E flat to F. I'm sorry. Sometimes I feel very sad, right? Which is actually pretty much the same as what the vocals were just doing. Now the instrumental track was doing this, so it is a change in the instrumental track, but it's pretty much the same as what the vocals were doing. A fairly simple E flat over C to F over C. We could argue whether it's a C minor 7 over a D minor 7. Basically, the chords are so indistinct there, you can pretty much make it whatever you want it to be. There's also not a lot of vocals to work with because we have all the counterpoint going on and the Spanish stuff that's in there. But notice how Brian is got all this, he's keeping the root the same, and he's creating the illusion of change in terms of the chords he's using, but really it's the same kind of back and forth, and it's creates this intensity, because it's like you've got this tension building in the right hand and this back and forth motion, and it really does kind of imply someone that just cannot make up their mind, especially because these two chords are suspended over the root, right? It never gets to the home key. Oh, I did leave something out. I'm sorry, all you guys are screaming at me. At the end of the B section, it does sort of resolve, because the D minor 7 shifts up to an F7, right? But it doesn't really offer any release because the root is still F. So if I go through and leave out the melodies and just focus on what the track is playing and what the vocals are doing, the B and C section, the pre-chorus and the chorus, are doing this. Then going to here. It's the same thing, just it's the pacing has changed, but what it implies to me is this sense of just you cannot get resolution, you cannot get relief, you can't solve your problem. And Brian hanging on that C for so long and making the pre-chorus and the chorus so similar in terms of what's making them up, but creating the illusion of change, again, it just sort of subliminally buttresses the idea of the song. So then at the end, sometimes I feel very sad. Then we have this really interesting little turnaround where it goes E flat major 7, and now I'm going to I'm going to commit sacrilege, because it's very indistinct what this next chord is. It's clear that there's an A in the bass, and I listened to a bunch of different versions of the track. And I listened to what the Brian Wilson Band did also live, and I think the Brian Wilson Band is wrong. I know, I'm challenging, I'm making all kinds of enemies today, but on this one chord, I'm sure they can school me on 100 others. But they've got something like this. They've got this E flat hanging over. I'm pretty sure that E flat isn't there. What I think it is this. I definitely hear this, and this is the only other note that sounds good to me, and there might be a G in there too. I can't tell, but I'm pretty sure there's no E flat. So I disagree with Brian Wilson Band on that one. But everything else is pretty clear cut, because then we go back to our little D minor 7 over the, what is it, it's a D diminished over a G. Pretty wild. So anyway. I'm going to take out that G because I don't know if it's there or not. also the that C sharp makes sense because you're moving the top part down a half step. So you got that same D minor 7 diminished thing going. So at the end we've got the same movement, C minor 9. I've guessed to the D minor 7, and then we go to a B flat major over that C, which is where we started. Then we're back to the same thing. So that, again, it's another one of these weird little root transitions to get Brian back where he started. We've seen that in other songs. Okay, so we get through all that, and then we do it all again. So then we get to the place where the theremin comes in. Wow, is that wild. Okay, so the theremin melody is... So underneath that, there's 2 horn parts. Hey there, Adam. I'm doing the final edit for the show, and I realized I wasn't super clear in this part when we're breaking down this theremin kick, as Murray Wilson would have called it. I talk about there being 3 parts. There are basically 3 melodic parts, but there are 4 instruments. There's the electrotheremin, then there's 2 parts, the top of which is about a 6th, then moving to a 4th below the electrotheremin, and then there's another part which sounds like it's the same instrument. And I don't talk about that because it's almost identical melody to the electrotheremin. There's a couple of notes different at the end. For sake of simplicity, I didn't get into that. And then there's a bass harmony, which is the other one I talk about. I'm not 100% sure of what these instruments are. I talk about being horns. There is alto sax on this track, also bass harmonica. But the top 2 of the wind instruments sound like the same instrument, and then the bottom one sounds like a similar instrument, but different. So I'm guessing that it is 2 B-flat clarinets in the middle 2 harmonies, and the bottom one being the bass clarinet. And so for the purposes of explaining this, I just skipped the lower of the 2 top instruments, what I assume to be clarinets, just because it's almost the same harmony as the electrotheremin. Is that as clear as mud to everybody? Great, let's continue the analysis. Ooh, this song is nuts. And the top part is roughly going in 6ths. And at the end it winds up in 4ths. Like that. Okay? The bottom is it moving in exactly a whole step below the top one, which is as dissonant as you can get. So, if it was a half step, I guess it would be more dissonant. But the bottom one is going... And I think the last one is a whole step. It's a little hard to tell, but there's a reason I think that. So, together it would be this. If I try to play it all together, so everything's in the same octave, it would be something, I don't even know if I could do it, but I'll give it a try. And the reason I think, besides my ear, that bottom horn moves down a whole step, and it's the only place it parts with its whole step, it moves down a minor 3rd, and that's the only way it departs from its whole step paralleling of the part above it, is with all that distance, we wound up resolving on a major chord triad. So it's really, really crazy. And again, Brian, not just with the use of the theremin, but with this really wild otherworldly harmonization and the sounds of it. I believe it's a regular clarinet and a bass, what's called a bass clarinet. They sound like clarinets to me. So that is really wild, and that takes us to the ending. Now, remember what I've talked about a 9 chord as being where we put a triad above a root. We usually don't voice every part of a 9 chord. But what's wild about these ending chords is the harmonies, if you put them all together, are actually voicing out every part of a C minor 9 chord, like so. And I pick out 5 vocal parts, Bruce on top, to my ear, Brian, Al, Carl, and I think the bottom one is Dennis and not Mike, but it's a little bit indistinct. The vocals go down like this. Again, it's that same irresolution, right? It's like it's pounding in your head. I can't figure it out. It's kind of expressing Brian's inner frustration. So you've got those two chords, then you've got this really interesting turnaround where, again, we're for the turnaround, we're doing the thing where we do a half step descending root, and it's where Bruce reaches for that high F. So this is how the final turnaround goes, and I'm not ashamed to say that I had to go through this a couple times to get it right. Again, this is why you have to be a little careful about saying it's this. You know, as Probin pointed out, it is kind of a fool's errand to get into some of these tracks where, as you'll see, what's on you've got what's the piano is playing, and you've got how the other instruments around it are voiced that might have some strange notes in it, and then you have the harmonies on top of them. And here again, you're going to see Brian voicing harmonies that don't match what's on the track. So you start out, like I said, it's a half step bass note thing from A flat to F, which is the 4 of the C, which has been the root throughout pretty much, right? That'll get us back to this. So the first chord is, I believe, a straight F minor over A flat, then a G7, again fairly simple. And then this next one is pretty trippy. The original backing track is just pretty much a straight F sharp 6. I don't think the C sharp, which would form the F sharp triad, is there. However, when you add what's in the vocals, some interesting stuff going on. Pretty clearly to me, if you listen carefully, Al, I believe, is singing an A flat or a G sharp. So he's singing this, which is creating a crushed chord. And then even more interestingly, the harmony below him, which I think is Carl, is singing an E, I'm pretty sure, which is very dissonant because you've got an E flat on top. So you wind up with this. Very, very snazzy. This G sharp creates the impression of a suspension that resolves to the G below it when we go to the last chord, which is an E flat over F. So check it out. So, roughly speaking, it's the ending part is this. Wow. And that, my friends, is how a classic is made. And with that, I'm not sure how much more I should say about I Just Wasn't Made For These Times, except it's a hell of a track, many people's favorite, a very meaningful song to many of us Beach Boys fans. And just very quickly, I want to mention that it was used as the title for a 1995 documentary and soundtrack about Brian's life. I believe it was Brian's second released solo album. He had one that was not released prior to that. And it also came out as a single on Sub Pop Records, which was a big indie label back then. Might still be around, I'm not sure. And that came out the following year. So yeah, the sort of rebirth and reevaluation of Brian's music that started to happen in the early to mid 90s, where the Beach Boys finally ascended to the pantheon up there with the Beatles and other like top tier bands artistically. This song, what it represented, what the title represented, was very much a part of that rebirth, and there's a reason that the documentary was titled after this. There's a reason that Heavy Duty independent label decided to release this song as a single at that time. This song, when you want to talk about the emotional depth of the Beach Boys, there's hardly any song that is more worthy of examination than this one. Next up, we have the instrumental track, Pet Sounds, the title song of the album, although it was originally called Run James Run. I'll talk about that in a minute. The instrumentalists on this, well, it's not going to easily translate over to my usual screen here. So, because the way this was done, because this was planned to be an instrumental from the beginning, it was originally going to be a song for a James Bond movie, supposedly. Brian knew he didn't have to conserve tracks, so he had a number of the regular studio musicians start out the track by playing various percussion instruments to kind of give it that exotica feel. So on the first track, we have on woodblock, slapstick, gyro, tambourine, sleigh bells, Tommy Tedesco, Carol Kay, Lyle Ritz, Plas Johnson, and Bill Green. Then after that, on the main instrumental attack on the overdub and elsewhere, we have my man Jerry Cole on lead guitar, Tommy Tedesco on acoustic guitar, Billy Strange on 12-string electric, Carol Kay on electric bass, Lyle Ritz, upright bass, Brian Wilson on piano, Richie Frost, unusually, not Hal Blaine, on drums and bongos, Roy Caton, trumpet, Jim Horn, alto sax, Plas Johnson, tenor sax, Barry sax, Jay Migliore, Bill Green on bass sax. I don't know the difference between bass sax and baritone sax. You guys can tell me in the comments. It's also interesting to note that Richie Frost's bongos were treated with the Leslie speaker, which is very, very unusual. This was one of the first songs tracked for the album. It was tracked on November 17, 1965. As I said, the working title was Run, James, Run, and Brian was planning to submit it as a music for an upcoming James Bond film. There was the fourth James Bond movie, Thunderball, was due to be released about 2 months after this point. So the theory is that maybe he had seen a trailer for it or some such, and that put this idea in his head. The stereo version, the da 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 da, which I think Jerry Cole plays, that guitar lick is much more prevalent than it is on the mono version. There's some things on this track that I really, really like. First of all, Richie Frost as drummer as opposed to Hal Blaine, I hear the difference. It just hits different if you don't mind me making a bad pun. But I do love his conga playing, or bongo playing, I'm sorry about that, which, as I said, has the Leslie speaker, which we've talked about before, which is kind of a rotating speaker that creates a sort of gurgling effect. It's most commonly used on the organ. It was used on to create that kind of gurgly guitar sound you have on the main melody line in this. It was also applied to the bongos quite uniquely. Speaking of the guitar, I love how weird it is. The playing is on the lead guitar is very out. There's just some weird guitar stabs, some weird notes, some weird chord choices. Brian seems to have just let Billy Strange get his strange on, another bad pun. And I really enjoy how kind of punk rock the guitars are. There's some very angular stuff, sort of anticipating what would happen with a new wave 15 years later. So at any rate, Brian does the song. You know, he had this in the can, and he decided that he was going to put it on the album, and he switched the title to Pet Sounds. Previously, the song Here Today had been the song that was called Pet Sounds, but so then he had some lyrics written for it, and then it became Here Today, so that all works out. Brian claims that he wasn't familiar with Martin Denny, and we talked about this before, who was the leading proponent of the type of music that was called at the time exotica, a forerunner to what we now call world music, although with more of an Asian kind of vibe to it. But he did credit Les Baxter and Henry Mancini, who certainly had done a lot of work that were Martin Denny adjacent, and he also once again referred to the music of TV themes. So for the umpteenth time, we see evidence that Brian was gathering a lot of ideas for his music around this time from what he was seeing on TV. This is perhaps Brian's most on-the-nose contribution to the exotica genre. It fits very comfortably with what Denny was doing at the time and other people that were making this kind of percussive based music. One of my favorite elements to this track is the bed of horns, the very smooth way they underpin all the chord changes. It's just the way they're mixed and the voicings and the chords themselves that they're playing over. Da, 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 ba, 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 ba. Glorious. Love it. There's not a lot more to say about this instrumental song. I mean, you know, it's great. I wouldn't quite put it in the same league as Let's Go Away for a While, which is, to me, just one of the most sublime pieces of music I've ever heard. But there's a little more fun and upbeat quality to this track, which is kind of a nice way to lift the backside of this album, which gets kind of depressing. Let's be honest about it. This song has rarely been covered. Every cover that I could find has been a part of more comprehensive tributes to the album. So, you know, I've talked a little bit before about how one of the reasons Pet Sounds as an album was late to be revered as a classic is at the time the use of two instrumentals for the album was seen as being kind of a filler move. I certainly don't agree. These instrumentals are quite wonderful, and each one does a different thing. Pet Sounds, the song, just has kind of a great vibe. It makes you feel kind of good, and there's just there's a playfulness to the guitar. There's a sort of a reassuring quality of the horns. The way the chord progression ascends, there's a sense of optimism there. You know, if this song wasn't here, the end of the album would probably drag you down into kind of a bad place if you were in the wrong emotional frame of mind. So even though I don't think this is the strongest track on the album, it's a really cool recording, and it has a very important role to play in the flow of the record. And that's all I really have to say about Pet Sounds, except another winner, another banger. And with that, we come to the final track on this seminal record, Caroline No. And the musicians on this track are as follows. On harpsichord, Al DeLore, 12-string guitar, lead, Glenn Campbell, rhythm, Barney Kessel, upright bass, Lyle Ritz. Tambourine, being played with a stick, Steve Douglas. Hal Blaine on percussion and drums. We'll talk a little bit more about the percussion in a minute. Frank Capp on vibraphone. Alto flutes, Jim Horn, Plas Johnson, Jay Migliori. Bass flute, didn't know there was such a thing, shows how much I know. Bill Green, 6-string electric bass with a delay effect added, Miss Carol Kay. Tenor sax, Steve Douglas. I guess so. Steve's doubling on this, so I should have put that up there. So I don't know how I'll handle that when I do the edit, but I'm sure I'll do something clever. And at the end, of course, the inimitable Barney and Louie, Brian's dogs, being handled by Dennis, his son Scott, and Brian's wife Marilyn. The locomotive sound effects are from the 1963 LP Mr. D's Machine by Brad Miller on Mobile Fidelity Records. Side A, track 1, train number 58, The Owl, at Edison, California. So anyway, this song was released as a single. It charted at number 32 as a Brian Wilson solo effort, something that Steve Douglas, who both played on this recording and also was working at Capitol at the time, really wanted to have happen. It was kind of his doing, and we discussed this at great length in one of the early parts of this, so I won't get too far into this again. But an interesting event. It's funny because number 32 is both a fairly low chart placing relative to the Beach Boys' prior commercial fortunes, but actually, considering the nature of the song, the downbeat sound of it, it's actually kind of a high placing also. You know, it's such an not obviously commercial track would make the top 40, and particularly without the Beach Boys names on it. The Beach Boys did actually perform it on the road a couple times at the time it was a single. As far as I can tell, there are no recordings of that. It must have been a pretty difficult song to do. I read one bad review of them trying to do it that it wasn't really that good, and I can kind of imagine how that would have been. Carl was certainly a fan of it. I assume he sang it in '66, and he called it on the 1973 live album one of his favorite songs that Brian wrote, and he did a beautiful reading of it himself with some flute that was done, I believe, by Ricky Fittar, and that flute solo was carried over to the live versions that were done by Brian in his solo work much later. But anyway, this song, which ends the album, is Brian at his most disillusioned. And again, we're getting, for one of the very last times, Brian speaking fairly openly and with depth about where he is at and where his thinking is at. And this is another warning sign that Brian is making some decisions about his relationship to the world and some of the ideas and ideals that he had, becoming an adult and thinking that maybe this isn't something he wants to do. Maybe he doesn't want to grow up. Like, I talked about this a lot when we talked about Beach Boys today, how that's a really fascinating album because it shows Brian grappling with young adulthood and going through a lot of the adjustments that a lot of us do when we hit our early 20s and we start having to confront adult responsibilities and accountability for our actions and the ways that we don't live up to our own expectations of ourselves and the way other people don't live up to what we are, our hopes. And there's a transition most of us make. And Brian was clearly trying to make this transition. And you start this album with Wouldn't It Be Nice, which is this has a lot of naivete to it. It's this idealized vision of growing up and how you're going to be able to stay up past your bedtime and do all kind of, you can play Clue with your girlfriend all night long, or whatever. And Caroline No is a very, well, it's no other way to put it, it's a rejection of the naivete and the hopes and aspirations of Wouldn't It Be Nice. It's where did your long hair go? Where's the girl I used to know? Your high school crush is all grown up and she's turned into a different person and you prefer sort of the idealized fantasy of what was. This is the first sign, the first overt sign that Brian is not going to make the transition to adulthood that he's been talking about. That he is looking around and seeing what that really means, what that really entails, and what that means to him as a person. And just like he warned us in I Just Wasn't Made For These Times, he's not getting the things out of this that he feels like he needs to thrive or even to stay emotionally healthy. So this is a tough place to end the album and a very downbeat conclusion, and it's you can't miss, if you're paying attention, how thoroughly Caroline No is the antithesis of the opening track, Wouldn't It Be Nice? It's a complete rejection of the sort of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed optimism of that track, and this is just a sort of a sad, disillusionment of all those ideas and ideals. Bruce Johnston has spoken eloquently about this song, and that I think the quote was, it's about the death of something that was very vital to Brian, his innocence. And he knows it too, said Bruce. And Tony Asher, I believe, was quoted as saying, Brian was saddened to see how sweet little girls turned out to be kind of bitchy, hardened adults. That's another take. But what's interesting about this is Asher, who wrote the lyrics, he had a woman, it's widely reported in Beach Boys lore that this is about a high school crush of Brian's named Carol Mountain. And it's very true that Brian tracked Carol down, let's put it that way, later in '66 and tried to have a meeting with her, and meeting didn't go very well, I guess. But that certainly indicates that Miss Mountain was on his mind. But what's interesting is Tony Asher had a woman that he knew in his mind when he wrote this song, and in his telling of it, the person that he wrote about had turned into kind of gone from kind of innocent person to a very worldly, sophisticated person after she had moved to the city. But in Asher's view, it wasn't a completely bad transformation. There was a lot of positive. The woman that he met wasn't the woman that he remembered, but she was an interesting, fully formed adult, and that had a different set of things to be interested in and to value, which is, you could argue, a more mature way to look at this phenomenon of maturation, particularly if we're looking at it from the point of view of men looking at women. But suffice to say that, Brian was coming from a different place, but I think it's good that we have Asher's interpretation, as in so many places of this album, to take the less savory edges off of Brian's motivations and thinking and put it in a more universally acceptable and relatable place. Everyone has experienced the feeling of losing touch with their innocence, losing touch with their childhood, losing touch with the things they thought were important when they were teenagers and when they were in their formative years, and having touchstones like people you went to high school with, people that you were attracted to when you were young, and meeting them again and seeing how they've changed. I've certainly experienced this. There are people that I went to high school with that have blown me away with the things they've accomplished in their lives, and there's other people that disappoint me because they were people that I learned from that that I derived values from that didn't uphold those values themselves. So, in my opinion, there's so many ways that you can relate this to your own life, and at the same time, it's something very personal to what Brian was going through. And I think it's best to look at this song less as being about Brian's sort of disappointment that a woman grew up and became somebody he didn't like as much, and more about him trying to grow up and finding out the world was a place he didn't like as much. And I think that is the more valid reading of the lyric, and it's the more productive reading of the lyric. And I think it's spot on to where Brian was at and where he was about to go. The lead vocal is by Brian. There are no other Beach Boys on this track. There's a little flourish at the end that on the old mono vinyl copy sounded like it might be a do-do-do, but it's really one of the sax players, I think Steve Douglas, doing a little Glenn Miller kind of a riff, but in the early lower fidelity versions of the album, it did sound a little bit like a backup vocal. But there's no band vocals on this. If I recall correctly, when the band redid this on their 1996 Stars and Stripes album, they did add a vocal arrangement to it. I think it was Timothy B. Schmidt who did the version of that on that record. So that's worth checking out. Brian's lead vocal was sped up at Murray Wilson's suggestion. Murray still being, even though he was out of the inner circle at this point, someone who had influence on the band and who Brian sought approval from time to time. This was supposedly a song that Murray was very moved by and even cried at. So this was a rare moment of Brian gaining the acceptance and approval from his father as an artist that he desired. One of the most unique parts of this song, and one of the most, if you're in a certain frame of mind, devastating sounds on the record, is the lonesome, thunky percussion that starts out this song. I mean, as an intro to the song, it just sets the mood of just desolation and heartbreak. And for a long time, this was said to be Hal Blaine playing at the back end of the Sparklets jug. And this apparently was not, according to the research team behind Craig Sawinski, I've credited them before, but this was not a Sparklets jug, but a percussion instrument called boobams. And I did have a minor disagreement with the gang earlier, and just to sort of, as a counter to that, give you a sense of the degree to which these people are dedicated to trying to figure out what was on these records. I did ask Craig how they'd arrived at this conclusion that it wasn't a Sparklets jug, as it had long been rumored, and this was the argument in the case, and I'm quoting from Craig here. 1, Sparklets only made glass jugs in the 60s. Plastic wasn't used for potable liquids by the consumer industry at all until sometime in the 70s. Hence, we know it wasn't plastic orange juice bottles on God only knows. 2, Hal Blaine is known to have used boobams. Photographic evidence exists. 3, John Brode, one of the experts I referred to, a percussion major, has played boobams, and I believe Jocelyn Hoisington, another one of the experts, the third being Will Carrar, was able to recreate that exact sound using a boobam sample and a universal audio reverb plugin. Between the two of them, anyway, they confirm that it is the exact sound. So, even though nobody is ever perfect, including very much myself, this will give you a sense of the lengths to which the people that have researched this have done to try and gain clarity on what was actually done on these recordings in areas where we can't be 100% sure. So that's a pretty convincing case that these are indeed boo bombs and not sparklet jugs being played, and so many kudos to them for the depth and devotion of their research, and I respect it very, very much. Once again, we have a bass, a counterpoint melody, like more lead bass happening, a Pet Sounds staple. Once again, we have a harpsichord with reverb, as it had done on I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. Didn't really mention it during the discussion of that song. The harpsichord playing against the reverb is sort of the main, the wash of that's the underpinning of the whole track, and it does give a lot of the Pet Sounds tracks their sort of neoclassical, otherworldly Baroque quality. You also have the sort of incongruous drum break where Hal Blaine goes crazy, and the little sax flourish there. These are both jazz interpolations in this otherwise sort of, as I said, kind of chambery kind of sounding song. And Brian has said that one of the big influences on Caroline No was Glenn Miller, and that does sort of explain why you have this weird little sax break and this weird little jazz break. It's just Brian again mixing in almost a jarring way different genres that usually don't go together, and so you have these little bits of not just jazz pop, but just straight jazz being just put into this kind of slow ballad. But yeah, Glenn Miller being an expressed influence on this particular song. Live versions of note, Brian's Royal Festival Hall performance in 2002. It's on YouTube. It's a beautiful rendition. Brian sings it wonderfully, and he hits the last note, the last high note, and the crowd just loses it. And I noticed that the Wonderments guys and the whole band end their live version of Caroline No with a quote from the Carole King song, It's Too Late, which sounds very meta to me. But of course, the final thing to happen on this track is the dogs barking. Interesting, lonely choice that Brian doesn't recall the motivation for. But the song begins and ends with sounds of loneliness. The thunk that suggests, even if it's not someone hitting a sparkless jug, the dogs barking in the distance, a train sailing off into the night. Brian may not be able to articulate now the reasons he chose those sounds, but they're the sounds of loneliness and the sounds of isolation and the sounds of, as Brian later would say, a cork on the ocean floating over the raging sea. Pet Sounds is a monument to Brian's production acumen, his songwriting choices, his ability to arrange vocals, his ability to make unique chord progressions and instrumental combinations, combine to create an emotional resonance that hits you on a subconscious level far beyond the lyrics, which Tony Asher did a stellar job interpreting. Asher coming out of nowhere and not a professional lyricist, an ad copywriter, and somehow being the perfect guy for the job. Bruce Johnston, in a recent interview, an excellent interview I might add, one of his few criticisms of this album was that he thought Mike Love should have been given a chance to do it on the basis of his prior work, particularly on the song Warmth of the Sun. Perhaps. But we cannot take anything away from Asher for what the job he was given, which was a difficult task, to translate Brian's thoughts into emotionally resonant songs that were still accessible to a broader listening public. Asher knocked it out of the park. He is the unsung hero of this album. And on this track, like all the others he participated in, he does yeoman work. This song has had many covers. It's one of the most resonant songs to other artists that on Pet Sounds. Notable artists that have covered it: Elliot Easton of the Cars, Eric Carmen, Dewey Bunnell of America, Glenn Frey of the Eagles, Chrissie Hynde of the Pretenders, and interestingly, a surprisingly faithful version by They Might Be Giants. There's a callback to Caroline No in Brian Wilson's 1988 solo album, and it could be argued that Brian never really returned to the sort of train of musical and lyrical thought he had in Pet Sounds until 1988. And people's opinions of that album vary, but generally it's thought to be a worthy successor to this album. Not as good, but quite good for what it is. And to the extent that it calls up memories of Pet Sounds, it's that much the better for it. But with the release of Pet Sounds, we are going into an era where the band's fortunes and its direction are about to radically change. And putting aside Good Vibrations, which is the next chapter in the band's story, from an album standpoint, this is where the band's progression will end. When I say progression, I don't mean that the band will stop making good work, that they'll stop growing, that they'll stop being artists, and they'll stop making growing as individuals and as musicians. But what I am saying is there's a noticeable path the band goes down from the point that they debut with Surfin' and Surfin' Safari, and increasing rapidly in terms of how that sound is developed from that point until this. And when we get into the next album project, we will see how that direction implodes. It supernovas. Brian keeps going, and then he can't keep going. So Pet Sounds is the end of an era for the band. And but what a work it is. You know, if you have to go out in a ball of glory, make an album like this before you do. You know, and so one more thing to talk about real quick. There is one outtake to Pet Sounds that we haven't discussed. It's a track that came out on the original CD release in 1990. It's called Trombone Dixie. It's just a track that Brian was working on in '65. He did a number of experimental tracks at the time, and he was working to get his chops up more, arranging strings and arranging horns. This, when it came out, it's very much of a piece of what Brian was doing in '65, and which means it was great. For whatever reason, Brian shelved the track, probably just because it just was fine. It wasn't any better than what Brian was doing in '65, but everything Brian did in '65 is pretty damn great. Musicians on that, real quick: Don Randy, grand piano, 12-string guitars, Billy Strange and Barney Kessel. Finger cymbals, interestingly, and rhythm guitar, Jerry Cole, Carol Kay, electric bass, Lau Ritz, upright bass, Hal Blaine drums, Julius Wechter on percussion, castanets, and vibraphone, Jerry Williams, Timpanies, Ron Swallow, their roadie and Carl's best buddy, sleigh bells, Roy Caton, trumpet, saxes, Steve Douglas, and Jay Migliore. And with that, we have finished our 7-part look at one of the most seminal records in the history of modern pop music, Pet Sounds. Truly brilliant work, and I'm proud to say that, for better or for worse, that I believe that this is the most comprehensive and detailed examination of this album that now exists on YouTube. I want to particularly thank Craig Slawinski for his tireless help and fact-checking of this broadcast, and his team that I've already mentioned for graciously providing much of the information I work from, and for all my friends in the Beach Boys community who support the show and who offer me constructive feedback and also praise when you feel like it's warranted. But having completed 7 parts of looking at Pet Sounds, we can all take a deep breath, take off our wonky music hat for a while, just feel the good vibrations and smile. I'll be back very soon, and we'll be talking some more about our favorite band, the Beach Boys. Till then, I'm Adam Marsland. Thanks for watching.